The next presenter is Allison Ryan, and she's going to talk about the use of barley straw for control of HABs. Thank you, Allison.
I'm delighted to participate in this Watershed Ecology Summit. I've been very impressed and inspired by the expertise and ecological commitments of so many of the prior speakers. My own relevant expertise is actually pretty minimal. However, I have indeed been quite active in water chestnut mitigation efforts for at least the past 25 years, which, alas, has brought me in very close contact with the increasing problem of cyanobacteria and their toxic blooms, which typically occur in the very same waters where we are foraying for water chestnut. Similar conditions favor the growth of both, which would be warm, stagnant, shallow, and over-nutrified water, where phosphorus has already played a leading role in other people's comments, and it is often the rate-limiting factor as far as cyanobacteria are concerned. So this conflict has led for me and many other water chestnut workers to have to abandon our water chestnut mitigation efforts in the last several years. As a neurologist, which I am, I've become especially alarmed by the myriad associated health hazards of cyanobacteria, as well as all the ecological disruptions and economic disruptions. So I've been researching the topic for a few years, trying to understand its complexities and promote awareness. And over the past few months, I've been focusing more on what we might do proactively to mitigate the cyanobacteria toxin problem, hence this talk. So I trust I have no need to convince this audience that decreasing algae and cyanobacteria blooms in our local waters would in fact be desirable, but I'd still like to start with a few points, which I call the toxin victims. You may have recalled about a year ago, 330 elephants were found dead in Botswana, and you can see two of them lying by the cyanobacteria bloom in their water hole. Over the past 30 years, there's been mysterious die-off of bald eagles and many other birds in the Southeast US. Finally, last year, determined to be caused by a new cyanobacteria species. By new, I mean newly discovered, identified, which is symbiotic with the water plant hydrilla. And not only is it a new, quote, species, but a new, quote, neurotoxin. And this has actually caused a new bird disease. So unfortunately, as hydrilla is moving northwards, I believe it's in Connecticut, maybe also in Massachusetts by now, we can expect this particular cyanobacteria species to be showing its potential as well. Dogs, it appears, are extremely sensitive to a lot of the cyanobacteria toxins. So they have a great deal of morbidity and mortality. One mouthful can kill a dog. Humans, there's a myriad of effects, but ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, is the one that really got my attention. They've identified neurotoxin BMAA, which is to date the only known environmental cause of ALS. And it was found in the vets returning from the Iraq War, which they got from the endocrusts of the deserts in Qatar, aerosolizing the cyanobacteria toxins there. Anyway, the next one is a question mark, but you may have heard the story of these two very skilled hikers with their 1-year-old and their dog who died while hiking near Yosemite about a month ago. And the leading culprit for their death is felt to be cyanobacteria toxin. Final verdict pending. And then from a very big perspective, the last great die-off, which was 250 million years ago at the end of the Permian era, in which about 90% of all the species then on Earth were killed, or disappeared, it was associated with a similar explosion of cyanobacteria per the fossil records, similar to what is happening now, according to some scientists who are sounding the alarm. And then bringing it right back to home, this is my arm, and that red rash is a streak that appeared about an hour or two after a single drop of water from Magnolia Pond trickled behind the gloves that I had that were elbow length gloves, but one drop from my kayak paddle trickled through and caused this rash. So barley straw. Barley straw has been shown to be what's called an effective algiSTAT. That means preventing growth. It is not an algicide, which means killing algae. Barley straw has many attractive aspects. It's eco-friendly, it's natural, it has no toxicity on other life forms, just on single-cell photosynthetic organisms, which by definition are algae and cyanobacteria, which of note are indeed photosynthetic bacteria. Barley straw is not an herbicide, it's not regulated in any way. It is fairly simple to use, and there are very well-established protocols dating back to the 1990s when the original research was done in England. There have accumulated ample data supporting its effectiveness in ponds, lakes, and streams. The EPA lists it on their website for harmful algae bloom control as effective, and doesn't mention any downsides of significance. Barley straw is actually in very common usage for small ponds, aquaria, livestock, water tanks, golf course, water features. If you Google barley straw, the first thing that will come up is Amazon trying to sell you little packets of barley straw or barley straw extract for exactly this purpose. However, to me, it seems that for the the ponds and lakes around here, at least, it's pretty much under-recognized and underutilized. So how does it work? Well, not entirely worked out, but the key is a slow decomposition of barley, and it has to be barley, not the other cereals or grains. It needs to occur in water, which has sufficient oxygen, has to have enough sunlight, the right temperature, which is a pretty big range, and the right bacteria, which are ubiquitous in the water at all times in any case. There is a slow release of chemicals, and one of them has been identified as humic acid. And eventually the end product that is the way it works, they think, is hydrogen peroxide, H2O2. And they think that the lignin of the barley straw is probably the source of this chemical reaction chain. So the release occurs in concentrations which prevent the growth of most green, especially the planktic algae, and many of the most worrisome cyanobacteria species, but the ones that are microcystins, and that's the liver toxin category, and anabina, which is the neurotoxin category. The concentration is very dilute, only 2 parts per million. I did mention barley straw extract, which works. It works much faster, but it's very expensive and not practical for large bodies of water. And furthermore, it requires multiple applications every 3 weeks or so. So there are always devils in the details. And for barley straw success, here is what I've gleaned from a review of the literature, which is not always consistent, but roughly 2 to 4 50-pound bales per surface acre of water is the recommended dose. You don't want to overdose, and you want to use the least amount necessary for the task at hand. The barley straw should be divided into loosely packed portions in, for example, in a non-biodegradable thing, such as a mesh onion bag, allowing for plenty of water circulation and exposure of the barley straw to the water. And you want to put it in about 2 to 4 feet water depth around the perimeter of the body of water. and it should be anchored with a rock perhaps, and somehow floated, at least in the deeper waters, with something. And you want to deploy the barley straw about 2 to 6 weeks prior to when you expect the blooms to occur. As I mentioned, it does not work on established blooms, and that is actually a good thing, because if you have an established bloom of cyanobacteria, which is full of toxins, then if you destroy the cell wall or the membrane, you simply release the toxins and disperse them more diffusely into the water and into the air. And unfortunately, aerosolized toxins are a real hazard. And I mentioned ALS, and it's the aerosolized version of BMAA that has been found to be the culprit ALS.
It's actually important for the dogs. This toxin.
It's best if the water is flowing at least a little bit, or not totally stagnant, and well aerated. Usually only one application per season around here is required. And the bags should be removed after they've done their work, after about 6 months, to prevent any unnecessary further nutrification, which of course, by putting barley straw in the water, you are adding some organic biomass, which is in general not what you want to be doing. So here are 2 different images from the literature. The one on the left is the onion bag with some barley straw anchored with a rock. And the one on the right is mats of barley straw. They look like they're about 4 inches by a couple of feet by a foot. And these are best, or they're promoted for use in streams which are flowing into a body like a pond, and sort of cutting things off at the source and maximizing the dispersion into the body of water. So we have over the past 3 months, as I mentioned, I've been talking to a lot of people about this. And so far we have a local barley straw project, and here's the current status report. Representatives of several local bodies of water are on board, and potentially these bodies of water will be involved. Warner Pond, I'm putting some estimates that I made up, about a little less than half of the 70 acres. Nashuanick and East Hampton, about half. Triangle and Magnolia, so far it's Triangle that's the problem as far as known cyanobacteria blooms. I and my water chestnut warrior, Lily Dwight, have for the past 3 years identified cyanobacteria in Triangle. And it's really at a pretty well defined point source. Well, not quite point, but one small part of that pond. So I believe we can target selectively. Great Pond is in Hatfield. Bachelor Brook is very small, but it's right at the mouth of the Connecticut, and it is loaded with water chestnut, and also with, we think, some cyanobacteria. Pine Island, private lake in West Hampton, the Oxbow in Arcadia, just preliminary discussions as far as that goes. And there's going to be a participation by Jacqueline Burmeister in Worcester, and she wants to do one of her ponds. So we're talking about 60 to 80 acres to be targeted, and we'll be targeting the sections known to be subject to recurrent blooms. So far, we have $2,500 committed to date, which is enough for purchasing 250 bales of barley straw. Aliki Fournier of the CRC is our project manager. Lab support is being provided for free by Jacqueline Burmeister of Worcester's DPW&P. Already we've submitted 6 baseline samples to her lab, which uses something called FlowCam, which is a device which I don't quite understand, but it apparently takes only 1 milliliter of water and then, does some photographic analysis and other kind of analysis to identify all the species of whatever's in there by name and by number. The other thing we're doing is exploring the use of some sort of pre and post aerial photos using drones, obvious choice. And in this regard, I have preliminary conversations with John Karras, who's at Smith, who runs what's called the Spatial Analysis Lab, and he's very enthusiastic about being involved, at least at the consulting level, with our project, which eventually I'm hoping might include using spectral analysis to distinguish green algae from cyanobacteria. Both have chlorophyll, but they're different molecules of chlorophyll, which have different spectral signatures. And currently, satellites deployed throughout the world are doing satellite imaging, also distinguishing cyanobacteria from other green stuff in the waters of the planet. So what are we even talking about? So on the left is the cyanobacteria bloom, most recently identified by me and Lily in Triangle. And then there's just some algae on the right side. So getting even into the more nitty gritty logistics, we've sourced the barley straw from Thrall Family Farms in Windsor, Connecticut. And they've agreed to hold 400 bales at $10 a bale for spring 2022 delivery. We probably won't need that much. Valley Malt in Hadley, or a Valley Malt in Hadley, has very, very kindly agreed or volunteered to provide her depot in Holyoke warehouse, I guess, to receive the delivery of the barley straw in mid-April, and let it serve there as a staging venue for putting the barley straw to prepare it for deployment. And she'll sponsor a volunteer day for this activity with publicity and provide a food and even a beer cart. There is, of course, labor required, preparing the BS packets from the bales, loading it into trucks, probably mostly, maybe some boats, transporting and positioning it in the bodies of water, and retrieving them, hopefully mostly empty packets in October. There are a lot more details to be determined, including the amount of barley straw per packet and the optimal distribution of packets at each site, taking into account, other considerations such as competing water use preferences like fishing and swimming and aesthetics. We will certainly need a lot of stakeholder cooperation, a lot of volunteers, a lot of onion bags, and some rocks, and maybe twine, and maybe some floats, certainly more public awareness and support. With that, I'd like to conclude by thanking a lot of people, all of whom have encouraged me or educated me, supported me in some way for this effort. And top of the list would be Jason Johnson and Aliki Fournier. And I'd like to also mention Cynthia and Jeff Botner, who have been extremely helpful, and Andrea Starkey of Valley Malt, who is so generous, Spencer Thrall, who will be selling us the barley straw, but agreeing to hold it over winter without additional storage charge and with free delivery in the spring. And with no commitment or prepayment required, which seems very generous. Paul Nowak is the head of Nashawanet Pond Steering Committee. He's very much on board with this. Dean Ryan of Fish and Wildlife has committed resources and money. Jeff Zessiger is of Pine Island, and he actually got me in touch with John Karras at Smith Spatial Lab, and Pine Island may or may not want to be more directly involved. Hillary Snook of the EPA has been very helpful with help in getting samples of suspicious cyanobacteria to him in his lab in the eastern part of the state for definitive analysis. Jacqueline Burmeister of Worcester has a lot of expertise in algae bloom mitigation, but has yet to try barley straw, and she's excited to do so. I'd like to just thank Harrison Bardwell for listening to me and saying that although he wasn't interested in personally growing barley, he had several ideas and headed me off towards Andrea Starkey. And then I'd like to thank all the friends who have listened patiently and with at least the appearance of interest in my enthusiasm and waxing lyrical about the potential of barley straw. And of course to Lily, who is has been with me every step of the way, carting, thousands of pounds of water chestnuts out of our local waters for years, and now on board with the Barley Straw project. So with that, there are some selected references.
That was wonderful. I think we're all honestly very interested in this because it affects all of us who paddle or fish or who are near water. Thank you very much. I'm going to suggest too that questions to Allison go through the chat